and say, you know now, if you've been following us for 3 years since we've been under the orders, the executive orders, I should say, ruled by executive fiat from Governor Bill Lee back in 2020, we've been working to make sure that that never happens again, right? And so we've seen a couple of bills submitted to the legislature since then that would limit the governor's emergency powers, right? Currently, in state law, our executive branch, i.e. the governor, has incredible power to exert legislative powers as a governor, which we've talked about numerous times. This is an absolute violation of separation of powers. Since COVID, I believe 7 state legislators across the country have passed laws reforming their Emergency Powers Act, restricting those powers of their governor, and at the very least requiring that should their governor create an executive order, that within, I think some of them are 28 days, I've seen one for 30 days, maybe 45 days, any renewal of those powers would require action of the state legislature. Now, in my opinion, the governor shouldn't be making any of these laws to begin with. We should nip that in the bud. It's unconstitutional. But at the very least, I appreciate some steps that states have taken to require action from the legislature within a certain amount of days. It's worth noting, in 3 years, we have still not addressed that in the state of Tennessee. So should another pandemic or something else occur, our current state law allows our governor to renew an executive order under an emergency every 45 days. It used to be 60. They changed it to 45 days. The caveat is the renewal requires no action from anyone but the governor. The governor currently in the state of Tennessee can, on an unlimited basis and upon his own authority, renew an emergency forever, right? And rule under executive order, meaning things like lock you in your home, shut down your business, make your kids wear masks in schools, or whatever it is that it's going to be. By the way, just so you know, since we think we're all protected here under our special session law for COVID, where employers can't mandate a shot, right, as a condition of employment, emergency powers in the state of Tennessee also give the governor authority under the emergency to suspend any current laws. Did you catch that? So all of the laws that you think we're passing right now that are defending your liberty, just so you know, under emergency powers, our law gives the governor the power to suspend any of those laws that he deems will interfere with the ability to protect the public in an emergency. Okay, why am I talking about this right now? I want to take you back to a couple of clips from this past session here in 2023. There was a bill submitted by Representative Brian Ritchie and Senator Mark Pody that would have addressed this issue and would have required any renewal of an executive order under an emergency to be renewed after 45 days by the action of the legislature. So definitely a step in the right direction. But it failed in subcommittee. Not only did it fail, hear me, in subcommittee, so it didn't even get to full committee, it never made it to the floor. It failed in subcommittee unanimously. And here was a question asked by Representative Kiesling. Listen to this.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is there anyone from? I noticed the administration has flagged this. Has anyone requested testimony from the administration?
No, sir.
Huh?
Now, you'll rarely hear this said publicly, especially on the public record in a committee hearing. Chairman Kiesling asked about whether or not this bill had been flagged. What does that mean? That is sort of the behind-the-scenes process of the governor's office letting all of the legislators know that the governor is against this bill. So, a bill being run to restrict the governor's powers during an emergency was flagged by the governor. In other words, the governor wanted the legislature to know that his office was against the bill that would restrict his executive authority. And interestingly, this seems to be what Representative Kiesling was concerned with. I want you to understand something. There were no questions, I repeat, there were no questions during this committee hearing about the Constitution, about whether it was constitutional for a legislature to delegate its lawmaking authority to a governor, about separation of powers, about anything having to do with your individual liberties and your rights being protected against the tyrannical rule of an executive. We talked about none of that. All we discussed was, well, what does the governor think about it? Well, of course the governor doesn't like it. We saw here in Tennessee a governor rule by executive fiat for over 20 months with no action of the legislature. Here was Valerie Yancey, the governor's legislative liaison, and here's what she had to say in this committee hearing.
That you cannot foresee what type of natural disasters or national emergencies could emerge that could cause a reason for the governor to need to do to use his executive powers for emergency services. And if there were something that kept the legislature from being able to come into session, this would give the governor the ability to continue to deal with emergency services. And I would say that if it were not a situation that you all could not get in here, you could call a special session at any time like you did during the pandemic. So there's nothing to stop you from calling a special session to deal with a perceived or actual misuse of executive powers of any governor in the future. So for that reason, we feel like the governor needs this flexibility to help the state when there is a serious situation occurring.
Did you hear the rationale there? So in the mind of the governor's office, again, we're not discussing separation of powers. We're not talking about the Constitution here. Her argument is, well, the legislature can call themselves into a special session at any time, which, to her credit, that is true. But her argument is, as long as the legislature doesn't step in and stop the governor, it's completely feasible and appropriate for the governor to rule by executive fiat. The governor can make any rule, suspend any law, do anything he wants, as long as the legislature doesn't stop him from doing it. But again, no one asks the question or cares that the Constitution, you remember the document that we the people put in place to direct the functions of our government? No one cares that that document does not give an executive that kind of authority. They only care as to whether or not we're going to let them do it. And by the way, for 20 months, we did. But let's continue. Again, why am I talking about this right now? If you remember, we alerted you to the fact that the Uniform Law Commission, this is a national organization based out of the Chicago area that creates model legislation for states to adopt across the country. And we alerted you to, it was SB 479 carried by Senator John Stevens that would have redefined money in our state in such a way as to allow for central bank digital currency. It also would have basically made unregulated cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin illegal in the state of Tennessee. This was the same bill that made national news that Governor Kristi Noem vetoed in South Dakota. It's worth noting that that law, carried by Senator John Stevens, has not been killed, and it's not been taken off notice, and it's not been withdrawn. Currently, SB 479 is scheduled for the first calendar of 2024 in Senate Commerce Committee. So we're still keeping an eye on that bill to make sure that it does not pass here in the state of Tennessee. But why is this important? Because the same organization, the Uniform Law Commission, is now proposing model legislation for emergency powers in all 50 states that greatly expand the powers of a governor in an emergency, even beyond the powers we've currently given him. And the reason that I think it's important to alert you to this and why I'm concerned about this here in Tennessee is because, incredibly interestingly, and I'll take you to the page right now. Let me pull this up. This is the website for the act that's currently being drafted. It's called the Model Public Health Emergency Authority Act. I want to show you this here. This is the members of the committee that have been appointed to draft this legislation. And as you look through this list, you should see something that stands out. And that's right. You see the state of Tennessee on that list. One of the members of this committee drafting this legislation is none other than Alberto Gonzales of Tennessee. He is the former Attorney General under George W. Bush, and also he's currently the Dean of Law at Belmont University here in Nashville. And this concerns me greatly because I'm going to show you a couple of things about this act that are abhorrent. But because of Mr. Gonzales's presence on this committee and his influence in our state, and I think the fact that most of the GOP leadership, I think, has a high regard for Mr. Gonzales, I think it's reasonable to assume that this model legislation, at the very least, is going to be submitted at some point to the Tennessee legislature. Our hope is that we can advocate to such a degree that it doesn't even see the light of day, because we actually need to be going the opposite direction of expanding the governor's powers in an emergency. They need to almost completely disappear, in my personal opinion. Again, as I've stated before, our Constitution only delegates lawmaking, policy-making powers to our legislature, not the executive branch. So I think we should be vigilant on this front. But I want to show you a few things about this bill. I'll go to page 8 here. Give me just a moment to get there. And so a few things to point out. Number one, currently in Tennessee, the governor can call for an emergency that lasts for 45 days, and then he has to renew every 45 days. This bill would expand that to 90 days. So the governor can call by executive order a declaration of a public health emergency. And that term can last for 90 days. Secondly, they argue that this is constitutional, right? As long as a legislature at least has the opportunity to call for a session or an opportunity to be in session. That's an important distinction. And it's important to note that would be the case in Tennessee. Constitutionally, our legislature can be called into session by an order of the governor, or by a 2/3 majority vote, the General Assembly can call themselves into special session. So Tennessee's Constitution does satisfy this particular law's requirement in the sense that our General Assembly can be in session at any time upon their own motion. But let's go back to the bill. The last thing you should note is it gives the governor the ability, again, to renew this declaration on an unlimited basis. There's no limit to the amount of times that this declaration can be renewed. So it's important to note that everything that would be required to make this model legislation effective in Tennessee, especially concerning the legislature, exists. But I want to reiterate this point. The question that's not being asked and what's not being addressed in a piece of legislation like this, including our current law, by the way, which I feel is wholly unconstitutional, is simply the question of, is this even constitutional? Is it appropriate? Is it constitutional? Is it legal for a legislature to delegate, to give away its lawmaking powers to the executive? My argument to you would be absolutely, emphatically not. If the Constitution doesn't allow it, which it doesn't, nowhere in the Constitution is this allowed, or is there even a process or a mechanism for this to happen. But the legislature themselves is creating a scenario supra-constitutionally, extra-constitutionally, or they are giving away a constitutionally delegated power. And this is not something being addressed by this model legislation. We're just assuming that this is normal. But here's some of the scary stuff. I'll take you to page 15. Again, you can take this to the bank. There's a reason I'm talking about this. This bill is going to get submitted here in the state of Tennessee. I can't say when, but I'm confident that we will see this in the legislature. Look at the list of things that it would allow the governor to do during a public health emergency. Acquisition, stockpiling, commandeering, management, distribution, or use of drugs, devices, equipment, or tests. How you like that? Doesn't that sound fun? Acquisition, allocation, distribution, management, or spending of authorized funds, zoning, operation, commandeering, use or management of buildings, shelters, facilities, parks, outdoor space, or other physical space, and the management of activities in those places. Get this: testing, isolation, quarantine, movement, gathering, evacuation, or relocation of individuals, of plants and animals. This is a fun one. Number 7, surveillance, monitoring, or assessment of the public health emergency and any of its effects. Here's the big one. Number 8, the governor has the power to provide for the suspension of a provision of any statute, order, rule, or regulation if strict compliance would hinder efforts to respond to the public health emergency or pose hardship or undue risk for compliance. In other words, let's just say we have a new pandemic, right? And the governor needs to make sure that he's going to protect the public from any effects of this pandemic. Under the current emergency powers and under these proposed orders, the governor does have legal authority. Again, not constitutional authority. We're just making things up as we go here, remember. But has the supposed authority to suspend any law that's on the books that would contradict his ability to enact what he's trying to do in order to protect the public during an emergency. This is incredibly dangerous. It means that in an emergency, all bets are off. There's nothing that we have done legislatively or could do legislatively in the future that would prevent tyranny by the executive branch, as long as the executive branch feels it prudent to suspend any of those laws that have been put in place. I want to take you to this last thing. It's a statement from Daniel Horowitz of Blaze Media. He wrote an op-ed on this proposed law, and here's what he had to say. The shocking punchline of the bill is to strip the citizen of any redress in court. Under current law, the onus of proof is on the government to demonstrate that what officials are doing is a vital state interest and is the most narrowly tailored way of achieving that interest before they can even abridge a fundamental right. But under Section 10 of this draft, however, the burden of demonstrating the invalidity of the declaration or all or part of the order is on the party asserting the invalidity. For example, you, the citizen. The bill narrowly defines the scope of judicial review and makes it clear that any ruling against the governor must be limited to the governor misinterpreting or capriciously applying the law, not against the constitutionality of the governor's order. In other words, this bill strips you of all constitutional rights. I'm alerting you right now. It's what we do here at Tennessee Stands. But before this even happens, before it even gets submitted to the legislature, I'm letting you know. Do not forget. I try to remind people all the time. This did not just happen in California. This was not just New York. In Tennessee, the governor signed executive orders that locked you in your home, that called you non-essential, that closed your business, that gave unconstitutional authority to county mayors to make mask mandates. We saw boards of health in local counties reigning supreme, telling you whether or not you could eat in a restaurant or go to the grocery store. What we did was insane. And the table is being set by this national proposed model legislation to see the same thing happen in the future. And we have a law professor, a dean of a law school right here, a former attorney general, right here in Tennessee, in Nashville, sitting on a commission proposing these same things to continue on into the future, while our legislature currently ignores any opportunities to place limitations on those emergency powers here in our state. I showed you these clips earlier of this proposed legislation here in 2023. And again, I want to submit to you, this subcommittee voted unanimously against the bill. We've not even been able to have a conversation here in the legislature about limiting the governor's authority. And now we're going to be faced with a proposal to greatly expand it. This is what's going on around you. I hope you're paying attention. Thank you for following, as always. Please make sure you subscribe to our email at tennesseestands.org. I would highly encourage you to go check out anywhere you listen to podcasts and subscribe to the Freedom Matters podcast. Kevin and I will continue to delve in and talk about this issue in particular. You can count on it.